Hello, welcome to the Seven Things podcast. I'm Mike Bird, author of the book Seven Things About the Bible I Wish All Christians Knew. And today we're going to be riffing off chapter 5 from the book, which is about biblical interpretation. What are the things that people need to know about the Bible to help them interpret it wisely, responsibly, and faithfully? And I'm not going to do this alone. I'm joined by my Ridley colleague and good friend, Andy Judd, who was with me in the first episode of the podcast where we talked about the Old Testament canon. This time, we're talking about biblical interpretation. And Andy definitely is one of the top people to interview on this topic because he has just submitted his PhD thesis on, I'm not joking, Shakespeare's use of the semicolon and its effect upon usage in the King James Bible. This man knows how to interpret a semicolon in the Bible, and out of that manifold wisdom, he's going to be able to explain to us Bible interpretation. So first of all, Andy, let's be honest, your PhD thesis was not on Shakespeare's use of the semicolon and its effect upon usage in the King James Bible. I think your thesis was actually on more mainstream hermeneutics, which is the science of understanding. Am I correct there, Andy?
That's right. That's right. So I have a dead German who I'm doing my thesis on and looking at how he helps us understand why we can't agree on what the Bible means.
Okay, well, great. Well, we'll get to that point in a second. I want you to imagine a Bible study where people are sitting around, with their Bibles open, maybe some Bible study materials on the side as well, and someone says, I think the text means X. Okay, so I think the text, or could be Isaiah, could be Paul, could be Luke, could be Malachi. They're saying, I think the text means X. When somebody says the word means, Andy, what do they mean? What do people mean when they say, I think the text means something? What is the meaning of meaning?
That is the question. That is the what hermeneutics is. It's the science of what does means mean. So three general answers that people give. Some people, when they say the text means, will be thinking about what they think was in the head of whoever wrote the text down. So getting inside the head of the author. The other group of people, somewhere in the middle, think that the text means whatever the text in its sort of mathematical equations of language sort of comes out with at the end. So you put together all the verbs and the adjectives, and that scientifically you should be able to work out what the text means. And then the third group of people, which are more sort of associated with the last, 50 years of our Western philosophical tradition, they think the text means whatever the reader thinks it means. So whatever you think the text means is what the text means. And they're the sort of the three general answers that people give. But yeah, what do you think the text means, Mike?
Yeah, well, I think it's a lot of those. I mean, I use the three analogies of is meaning like something that's locked in a box. So the author's mind is the box, and you've got to find a way into the box to find the meaning. Okay, so that's kind of meaning is authorial intention. And then there's, you might call that the literary version. I call that game of Scrabble. That's where you're kind of, putting all the letters out and trying to make sense of it. And then I think there's what I call meaning as a mirror. What the text means is largely what you project into it, or what when you see into it with your own self at the forefront. So I mean that's the three different ways of thinking about meaning. I think a lot of people tend to go for the box thing, where you've got to get to the author's mind and you've got to get into the box. But I tend to think that meaning can be like a fusion of all three. You've got to take into account the author, the intention, and see the author's intent enacted in the intentionality of the text, but recognize that text can have a dynamic or possibilities, or, you like this phrase, Andy, text can carry surplus meaning. more meaning than the original authors themselves were aware of. And also we read in light of our own experience. Like, it's one thing to read, say, the household codes of the New Testament in Ephesians 5 or Colossians 3 and 4, to read that as like us, a middle-class white male in suburban Australia, is different from, say, reading it as a 19th century Black American slave living in the antebellum South of America. I mean, there's a different experience you have, and yet different responses will happen when you read these texts. So that's I don't know. I'm not an expert in hermeneutics, but that's my understanding of the debates we have about the meaning of meaning. Anything you want to add to that, or maybe even correct or rebuke me on, Andy?
No rebuke. But yeah, essentially what you're choosing is the D, all of the above option, which is, in my opinion, sort of what we want to do, right? Like we want to be seeing what the text means within the situation that it was created. We don't want to be sort of taking things completely out of context. But at the same time, if it's locked in the past and is all about the context that Moses was in, then it doesn't say anything to us now. Whereas as Christians, we want to hold on to all three things at once. We want to say that Moses wrote this text, or God wrote this text, or Jeremiah wrote this text, and it meant something in that context. But it still means something now, and that meaning is still relevant to us today. So, Moses, as an example, Moses forbids murder. He was probably thinking about strangling someone or throwing rocks at somebody. That still applies to shooting someone, even though Moses had never seen a gun, because we are able to, the text is sort of has a surplus of meaning, if you like, or is able to be recontextualized today and still say something profoundly true. And I believe we can still hear God's voice to us through that text. So yeah, all of the above, always the right option.
Okay. Well, let me add on to that. There's been a debate within hermeneutics. Many years ago there was a article. I think it was written by a guy called Krista Stendhal, or maybe someone else. He talked about the difference between what a text meant and what it means, as if there's kind of the original setting, then its application. But some people have rejected that for being a little bit too simplistic. Okay. So where do you stand on the what it meant and what it means? Or I think some would say it can only be what it means. There is no meant. There's only what it means. So where do you stand on the meant means debate when it comes to the meaning? I mean, this is so confusing, I know. Is it what it meant and what it means on the debate about the meaning of biblical text?
Yeah, you sometimes see a similar distinction, pardon me, in the a similar distinction in the meaning versus the significance of a text. And look, I'm not going to say that's wrong, but it's pretty wrong, because when you go back and read to try to understand what it meant, you're still understanding it relative to us. You're still imagining what it would be like to be in certain situations and projecting that meaning onto the text. And you're already coming to the text with your own reason for reading it. I mean, why am I picking up this book? Well, because I believe God is speaking to me in it. Well, that's kind of meaning currently. So it's sort of hard to separate significance from meaning, or what it means from what it meant. So I prefer to see it as a bit of a circular process where we have certain preconceptions and our own perspective about what we think the text is and is doing, and then we try to go back and read into the text and understand better the situation of the speaker, and through that process, going again and again, we get a better kind of fix on their world, but also that changes our world, because we don't really want to study the Bible just to find out what it meant. That might be interesting for sort of archaeologists and scholars, but I'm interested in the Bible because I think God is speaking to me in it, and so I want to hear what He's saying now. And to be honest, Moses was a person, I'm a person, we're not that different. So I think I can understand something of his world in relation to my own.
So knowing a little bit of back then is okay, but we're still interested. and primarily in our own what it means and how it applies to us now, and we can't block that out.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. Now, I know something you're very interested in terms of your doctoral studies and even just teaching, Bible in a theological college, is the importance of genre. Or not, if I say that properly, is it French? Genre, 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 whatever it is. And what is genre, and why does it matter in biblical interpretation?
Yeah, and I appreciate your outrageous French accent. Um, yeah, so genre, it is a word from literary studies, but it is very, very present in the Bible. You notice when you pick up the Bible that it's not all one thing. There's different kinds of Bible in it. So you read a psalm, and that's a certain type of thing, a kind of thing. But then you read the histories, the story of David, say, and that's a different kind of thing. And those different kinds of thing, they're all God's word, and they're all authoritative, and they're all true, and they're all relevant to us, but they ask different things of us. So when I'm reading David's story, I'm very aware of his circumstances. I'm very aware of how that kind of events played out in the past. When I read a psalm, it's much more about general human experiences with God. Most of the time, the Psalms don't tell me what the original circumstances were. I just have to take their observations about what it's like to be a person, what it's like to know God, and I can apply that to myself pretty directly. So different genres, they require different things of us as readers. Just like a detective novel requires something of me that's different to my doctor giving me a script for medicine, which requires something quite different of me. They're different genres, they're different kinds of things, and they're all true, but we need to take to these different things with different strategies and different and apply them in different ways.
So, genre does matter then. We can't just treat everything it's the same, because genre will kind of set up our expectations and how we have to take all these things individually, and then the biblical canon together. So we can't gloss over genre. These questions matter. Can you point to an example where genre really matters? I mean, is there some sort of particular debate you can think of where okay, this is kind of a big deal, and if you get the genre wrong here, it's going to have all things. I mean, obviously we could. If we wanted to, we could go to debates about, the book of Genesis, the opening chapter of Genesis 1, and is this kind of a scientific report as if it was written by Stephen Hawking himself about the origins of the galaxy, or is it more of theistic poetry? There's those sorts of debates, but can you think of anything where this genre debate really comes home and shows people, our listeners, why it matters really?
Yeah, well, maybe a slightly more subtle example, and hopefully less controversial these days. Back in the 19th century, there was a big debate, you sort of alluded to it earlier, over whether God is okay with slavery or not. So in the you mentioned the antebellum South, before the Civil War, you had preachers and politicians quoting the Bible to either support the idea that slavery is cool and we should all have slaves and that's how God intended it, or to say God actually really doesn't like it when we enslave and mistreat other humans. And interestingly, they drew on the same text a lot of the time. So my research was into Genesis 16, which is the story of Hagar. And I read through all the sermons and all the pamphlets and all the political speeches I could find where they read this story of Hagar. Same text, same question, same historical time and place, same access to knowledge about the ancient world. And yet they come at very different conclusions. One group of people, the pro-slavery people, if you like, take the text, the story of Abraham and Hagar in Genesis 16, as an example, right? So this is what Abraham did. He had a slave, he mistreated her, or Sarah mistreated her, and that's what we should do too. Right? So it's like a morality play or a parable or something. But then the other group of people read the story of Hagar just as a description of history. in which God was working, but just because Abraham does something doesn't mean we should do the same thing. So for them, narrative wasn't normative. It was just a description of fact. Abraham had a slave, but we don't look there to find out whether God is pro or anti-slavery. So they were reading the same text with slightly different conceptions about the genre. What are we meant to do with this thing? What kind of story is this? Is it something we're meant to copy and emulate? Or is it a description of fact from which we're meant to, I guess, look a bit more carefully to discern how God feels about events? And that, can I say, genre made a big difference there, especially if you were a slave, right? That really made a big difference to how your fellow Americans saw you through that picture.
Okay, so this kind of stuff does matter, which is good to hear. So all this stuff about genre, it's not just all weird, high flung theories about literary knowledge and learning, that type of thing. It really does matter for reading the Bible and the application of the Bible, and also the ethics of reading the Bible. Okay, that's very important. That would suggest to me that your research in the area of literary studies and genre might actually be, at some level, interesting.
Wow.
Wow, yes.
Settle down there, Mike.
A PhD thesis that's interesting. Andy, can you share with us, and think here of the average layperson, what is your PhD research been about? Because I know this sort of science of interpretation, we call hermeneutics, is very much your wheelhouse. So can you tell us a little bit about your PhD studies on interpretation?
Yeah, so normally we sort of, we just interpret, we don't think about it. Right? So I read a sign on the side of the road, I know what it means. I see a newspaper headline, I read it, I don't think twice about how I'm thinking about the meaning of it. Hermeneutics is really just about thinking about how I'm reading something and being a little bit more self-aware. And that's particularly important when there are controversies or difficulties, like in that example I gave of Hagar's story, where it is actually helpful to slow down and go, okay, what am I assuming here? What is just so obvious to me that I don't even think that it is a thing? But when I meet someone who comes from a different angle, that makes me aware that I have certain, I guess, assumptions that I'm bringing to the text. Normally I think you have assumptions and presuppositions. I'm just reading the text. But hermeneutics is about going, well, hang on, don't be fair. We all bring assumptions to our reading. So what are they? My thesis was on that subject. Why do smart people who are trying to read the Bible seem to keep coming up with different understandings of what it means? And every thesis needs a dead German to kind of give it some heft. And so I drew on a dead German called Hans-Georg Gadamer, who was a 20th century philosopher, lived from 1900 to 2002, worked and taught in Germany over that time. So he experienced the full spectrum of political and social change. And his sort of answer to the question we were talking about before is a bit of the, we're talking about, is it the text, is it the reader, or is it the author? He's sort of in that, D, all of above kind of category. So you're on safe ground with me, Mike, in choosing that. He also sort of invented the idea of the fusion of horizons that goes on when we understand an old book. We sort of fuse it with our own worldview, if you like, and we don't sort of just make it say whatever it wants, whatever we want it to say, but we make it relevant into our own world, and that's part of understanding an old book, that we kind of bring it into our own world. So he's a helpful guy. He makes it about not just the author, not just the reader, but both. Readers find new and relevant meanings for the text in response to new situations and new questions, but they're still constrained by the text that we have in front of us, by what they know of the situation that it was originally spoken into, and by the genre. And that's sort of, 100,000 words later. That sort of fairly common sense approach is what I came up with.
Well, great. Well, we wish you every success in your doctoral defense, and you get passed, and you get given your doctorate with a university medal added on top, Andy. We wish that
Thank
for
you.
you. We wish that for you. Yeah, I mean, I had my own dead German as well. I did my PhD thesis. I did my PhD thesis on Jesus and the Gentiles, and my dead German was a guy called Joachim Jeremias, and I had to read through his book, Jesu Verheißung für die Völker. No, for the Heiden, Völker or the Heiden. Yeah, well, Jesus's promise for the nations is kind of what I had to cover. So yeah, I know about the having a dead German in your PhD thesis. But coming to a close, then, Andy, let me ask you, what are some basic tips that the average Bible reader, in their maybe in their quiet time or in their Bible study group, what are some basic tips you would give for biblical interpretation for the average layperson out there? I mean, not everyone can do a PhD thesis on Gadamer, and looking at the wrinkles in your eyes, they may not want to. But what are some basic tips you can give to some people who just want to get, who want to treat the Bible faithfully and responsibly, and they want to get the most out of the Bible? Do you have a few tips off the cuff you can give to us?
Yeah, a couple of things spring to mind, Mike. One of which is just to be really kind of open to understanding the world that the text was originally spoken into. That's one of the most helpful things we can do, because it's a bit weird for us. It's a bit like jumping on a plane and going to a foreign country. When we arrive in Bible land, it's like the food tastes funny and everyone's speaking a different language and they're driving on the wrong side of the road, and it's quite disorientating. Or at least it should be, unless we're just not observing anything. There's different things. There's different marriage customs, different social situations. It can be quite hard to understand what's going on. And I think my advice there is to be like a good traveller. Ask questions, slow down, don't jump to conclusions. It may be that entire civilization and all history up until about 2005 were evil, but maybe they were living in a different world. And by being good travelers, we're sort of open to that new experience. I guess one of the things Gadamer talks about is you can't guarantee you're going to be right about a book in advance, but you can be open to new experiences. And that's sort of what he recommends and I recommend. The other thing that can help with that is actually reading with other people and people who have a different worldview to yourself. One thing that happens when you read with people who are quite different to yourself is it foregrounds, it brings to your attention some of the assumptions that you didn't know you were making. So an example of this I could give in one of my classes on Genesis. We were looking at the way that a couple of the Old Testament figures, they have multiple wives, and when there's a conflict between the wives, they don't intervene. And I thought, what absolute rubbish human beings those patriarchs were, not kind of defending and getting involved. What kind of rubbish excuses for men they must be. Well, one of the women in my class who actually came from a culture where in her family her cousins had been in polygamous family units, she said, "Oh well, no, actually that made total sense to me because as the husband, you don't get involved in the women's side of the family in those disputes." Like if you kind of respect that separation, they would never get involved. Now she wasn't endorsing that sort of worldview. She certainly wasn't endorsing polygamy, but her experience was able to foreground something I was assuming that I didn't even know I was assuming. I had a picture of kind of what the right thing to do would be, and I was prematurely judging the outcome of the text based on that. So reading with people who are different and being open, to the shock horror. I might be wrong. I mean, we don't often have that assumption, right? We don't often assume that we might be wrong. But that's actually the most powerful tool in good reading is that openness to the possibility that something I believe might not be the truth. And conversely, as crazy this sounds, Mike, you might have something to share with me that I don't know yet. And that sort of posture, that humility, I think it's key to good reading.
That sounds like some very, very good advice, Andy, that I guess anyone can take away. A willingness to learn from others, an openness that one could be wrong. So, yeah, I guess you could say we all need a little bit of humility, willingness to learn and a willingness to admit we might be wrong. And anyone who's changed their mind on anything as it relates to the Bible should be open to that, because if you've changed your mind on something, it means you've admitted that you were previously wrong on something. So I think anyone who's got like a little bit of humility or just willing to grow is going to accept those suggestions. Well, thank you very much, Andy, for joining us. I've been talking to Andy Judd from Ridley College. I'm Mike Bird, author of 7 Things About the Bible I Wish All Christians Knew. Thank you for joining us. It's been a treat.